Okay, so my name is Barbara Kaim. I was born in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, in 1958 and have lived here almost my entire life. I sort of left after high school and went and studied. I did my undergraduate in Johannesburg at Wits, then left the region and went to the United States and did my master's there and spent a little bit of time. And then once independence came here in Zimbabwe, I wanted to come back. So I came back here in 1982 and have more or less lived here, almost the entire time. I've spent a few years out, but have been here relatively most of my life. Yeah, and still live here. And it's now 2026 and I still live here. Yeah. So, both my parents, my father is from Breslau, which is now Waszlaw, Breslau in Germany. It's now Waszlaw in Poland, but he grew up in Germany, and my mother grew up in Berlin, Germany. So both of them come from that part of the world, and for a few generations back, and were quite affected by what happened in last century. My father's father died. My grandfather died when my father was really young. He was about 12 or 13 years old. And then my grandmother, with her 3 sons, moved to Berlin. And when the Nazis started coming up, and she had the wisdom to move to the Netherlands, to a place called Wassenaar, suddenly had a blank, a place called Wassenaar. She had her thinking, and she had a lot of foresight, my grandmother. A number of times she had a lot of foresight. Her thinking was that the Netherlands was neutral in the First World War, so maybe this was a safe place, as she saw things getting more and more unsettled leading up to the Second World War. My mother came from Berlin. My grandfather was a psychiatrist living in Berlin. He had won it's funny because I'm being interviewed, I'm getting a few blanks, but doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. He won the Cross of Bravery in the First World War. He saw himself as really German, more than being Jewish. So as things were getting hotter and hotter, he really did not want to leave. He really did not want to leave. And even though his patients were saying to him, Dr. Stern, it's time for you to leave, he just really did not want to leave. Of relevance here, because it'll come up as very important later, my mother's closest friend was a woman called Uti. And Uti was my father's first cousin. And this becomes very relevant in terms of how my mother and father met during the war. My mother was there through the whole of the 30s. Hard time to be in Berlin through the 30s. She talked a lot about what it was like to be in Berlin during Kristallnacht. It's one of the clear stories she used to tell about how she would left home in the morning after Kristallnacht. And at that point the family hadn't heard about this, and she was walking to school and noticed that there were a lot of buildings that had burnt down, and then at some point realized that all the buildings that had burnt down were Jewish owned shops or homes. And at that point something clicked in her, and she turned around and ran home just sobbing. And in the meantime her mother, my grandmother, had heard this and was like desperate and panicky about this. And I think that was a real difficult to know. But I sometimes as an adult reflect on that and wonder whether that was one of those really turning points in my mother's life of realizing, whoa, this is serious. I wonder whether that Kristallnacht was one of my mother's turning points. Anyway, so hit the 30s. My father's mother, my grandmother, sitting now in the Netherlands, realized that things were not going well generally in Nazi Europe, and she has 3 sons, and she thinks it's time to get her 2 eldest sons, my father, who is the middle son, an older son, Peter, out of Nazi Europe. And to cut a little bit of a long story short, Uncle Peter ends up in England, and my father is sent to a really good friend of my grandmother's in Johannesburg, which is how my whole family ended up in Southern Africa, because of Mrs. Hillman. So anyway, so my father now ends up in Johannesburg at the age of, I think he must have been around 16. Never to see his family again, by the way, except for his older brother, who ended up in England. And my mother is still in Germany. And late in 1938, my family always used to say thanks to Chamberlain, who said, no war, not in my life, not in this lifetime, and delayed the war by a few months. And my mother's family managed to get out of Nazi Germany I think it's in January 1939, a few months before the war, before the invasion of Poland. And they get onto a boat and they end up in Palestine, in Jerusalem. My mother is about 16, 17, really had a hard time. Ends up at Bezalel Arts School and settles there. My father ends up, when the war breaks out, joining the British Army South African Regiment and starts fighting. He ends up in Egypt and fights at El Alamein. My mother is now in Jerusalem. Enter the relationship between my mother and Uti, the close friendship, and that being my father's cousin, because my father hadn't heard anything from his family, from his parents, and has heard of Lieselotte Stern, and thinks that Lieselotte Stern will know something about his family, and when he's on leave goes to Jerusalem and meets my mother. And there's this amazing photograph of my mother, looking rather shy and young, next to my father and his entire South African regiment in army uniform, in front of the Golden Dome. It's the most beautiful picture, and that's how they meet. And they meet 3 times in the next 5 years, and there's a whole correspondence between them. And at the end of the war, my father and mother marry by proxy. With my mother in Jerusalem, my father in Johannesburg. My father marries Mr. Goldberg, standing in for my mother. Mrs. Goldberg is the best man, and my father, so the family folklore goes, sends a telegram to my mother saying, marriage satisfactory, otherwise unsatisfactory. And on the basis of that, this is how my mother can get onto because there was so much movement after the war, could get onto transport to unite with her husband. Otherwise, it would have taken forever. And thus begins my parents' life in Johannesburg, with my mother at that point not speaking any English, and my father having quote unquote forgotten his German. My father having lost his entire family in Germany. They all had not survived Nazi Germany. My mother had lost a lot of her family, although her parents and her sister were in Israel, so they survived, but other members of her family. So it was quite a post-Second World War trauma, and they came together. And then when the Nationalist Party, who were pro-Nazi, came into power in 1948, very soon after that, a few years later, and also because my father had found work in an electric company, they offered him a job in Bulawayo. So they then moved from Johannesburg to Bulawayo. And that's how we ended up in what was then Rhodesia. So my sister and brother, my older sister and brother, Yvonne and Rob, were born in Johannesburg. I was born in Bulawayo. We lived in Bulawayo until I was a year old, and we then moved here. Just a little sideline, which I think is kind of relevant for this understanding the impact of Germany, and I think it's a really Jewish thing. The attitude post the whole trauma of Nazi Germany was the more passports, the better. That was I don't think my father was alone in this. The more passports, the better. So even though I was born in Zimbabwe, my father registered me as South African. So in theory, I'm eligible for South African passport, and I have a Zimbabwean passport. And my family, when they moved to the United States, which they did, made sure that I was eligible for an American. I mean, plus because of my parents' heritage, I'm eligible for a European. I mean, it's like, and so that was one of the sort of long-term effects of being brought up, I think, both from Nazi Germany and also being brought up in Rhodesia, where the passports didn't mean a lot. Although I don't have all those passports. But I'm eligible for all of them. And that's really such a, I think, maybe Jewish Southern African, I'm not sure. So here I am, being brought up in Rhodesia. I am of the generation where I became a teenager in the 1970s when the war shall I carry on with that? Brought up in the 1970s. Harare was very important influence for me, I think. Close to nature and simple in your ways. I think the older I got, the more I valued that as a principle of life. How wonderful is that as a message to give us as we're growing up? Close to nature and simple in your ways. I can't think of anything wiser, actually. And then also the discussions we had at Harare, Zionism, socialism, and communism. Yeah, I remember those discussions. I also think those were really important to me because I didn't get that type of critical thinking in my traditional schooling, but I did get that in Harare on a Sunday, or Harare in my camps, whether it be at Onrust or Bulawayo. I didn't get those. So Harare was really important in that way. But then I hit Joburg. And I hit Joburg in 1976. That was my first year. Little Rhodesian girl in my crimpoline dress, first year away from home. Intense time of war in Rhodesia. Brought up as a Jewish liberal. Feeling a sense of injustice around what had happened. Being brought up, like knowing about what had happened to my family and sort of this whole Jewish history as being Nazi Germany. There I was, my first year in Johannesburg, away from home. It was the peak of the war in Rhodesia. It was a confusing time, really confusing time, because I've been brought up with these liberal tendencies in my family and in my Jewish community. I had been brought up recognizing about the oppression of Jews in Nazi Germany. I've been brought up with this strange understanding of black oppression, both in Rhodesia and in South Africa. Harare had influenced that as well. And here I'm in Johannesburg, and 16th of June, 1976, the whole of Johannesburg and Soweto explodes. And not only does Johannesburg and Soweto explode, but so does my brain. I mean, everything just... And by the time it settled in my brain, everything had shifted for me. I changed the degree that I was doing, everything. And I then spent the next 3 years of my undergrad trying to understand, who am I as a white African Jewish woman. So 16th of June 1976 was the Soweto uprising, and it was a massacre with, it was started by Soweto children, like literally school-going children who were protesting that the apartheid government had said that they were saying that all education had to be taught in Afrikaans. And they'd started off as school children walking the streets of Soweto, who were met with guns by the apartheid police force and were gunned down. And there's this very famous picture of one schoolgirl holding, he must be 8 or 9 year old Hector Peterson, now a famous icon, with a screaming face, and he was the first child who had been murdered by the South African police force, and then the whole of Johannesburg, the whole of Soweto, and actually the whole of the country just broke up. And so did Wits, the white liberal university, and as I was saying, so did my brain, because I suddenly had to question who am I? Who am I? And it really was an extremely important time in my life, because there were these 4 definitions of myself: white, Jewish, Southern African woman. And I really had to look, and it's the age as well. I was 20 years old. Yeah, not even 19 years old. It was that age. And then 1977 was the murder of Steve Biko, and it was a he was a nationalist in South Africa, who died on the police car traveling from Port Elizabeth. He'd been beaten up and died in the middle of winter in a police car from Port Elizabeth to Johannesburg. So it was quite a radicalizing, and that's when I really found my Africanness. And I think is the reason why I don't think I've ever left the region since. It really rooted me as African. It didn't mean that I wasn't Jewish. It just meant that I wasn't going to leave this region so quickly. I felt very rooted here. So I then finished my degree in Johannesburg. My family in the meantime was still, my sister and brother, who were much older than me, in the 70s, in the peak of the war. My sister got married to Barry, a good South African, and they moved to Boston. And my brother went and, of course, skipped the Rhodesia to not go into the army, as many Jewish young boys did at that time. And he ended up first in the UK, and then eventually also with his wife ended up in the US. So my whole family had migrated to the US. So I went to the US after I'd finished, because that's where my family was, and I did my master's there. But I was really torn, I remember after independence, and I did come back here in '82 after independence, I often had this image of having one foot in Zimbabwe, one foot in the East Coast, the United States, and that big chasm, my body being torn, because this is where I had my in a sense, my spiritual home, my soil. My soil was there in Zimbabwe, but my family home was there, and my family was in Boston. And that's been, that whole tension has been for most of my life, Yeah, I guess that's been my story of my life. Because my family is all still on the east coast of the US, and then I married an American who picked up roots and came to live in Zimbabwe and has become very Zimbabwean in his own way. And so we built a life here, had a family here, lived through the ups and downs of Zimbabwe for sure, and there have certainly been ups and downs, and still feel the richness of the soil here, and it does feel rich. You pick up the soil and there's a richness here. So about my adult spiritual growth. I'm very connected still to my Jewishness, and especially having explained my family background. How can I not be? How can I not be? In Zimbabwe, having such a small Jewish community, and it being Orthodox, and I feel much more connected to conservative or reform, I've found myself very happy and very thankful for going to my Jewish friends for high holidays. That's been really important to me, for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover. Deeply thankful for continuing those traditions here in Harare. On a much more weekly basis, I've connected with a very warm and welcoming Buddhist community, which has also been very influential because Buddhism has got a lot to do with the workings of the mind, which I'm very interested in. And I've really enjoyed how much Buddhism has helped me in my own psychological growth, actually. So I've really enjoyed that part of it, and I have some really close friends who come from the Buddhist community. So I've and what I love also about Buddhism is you don't have to reject any other religion. You can be Buddhist and Jewish. So I've played both of those in Zimbabwe with great comfort, actually. So that's been my spiritual growth here. Yeah. So Johnny and I have one son, Sam. He went to Sharon School. At that stage, I think there were 3 Jews at Sharon School. And it was lovely. Sharon School was, and I think remains, such a lovely community school. And after that, he went to Hellenic. He went up to O-level. And then after that, he was very fortunate that he got scholarships to go, and he finished doing his. He actually didn't do A-level. He went and did. So he then finished his high school outside the country, and he then just went out into the big wide world. He spent 2 years finishing his high school in Costa Rica. Then he did his undergrad in the US, his grad in the UK. I mean, he's traveled all over the place, remained really, really connected to this part of the world. He did his master's in African studies, loves this part of the world. He got very into theatre, and especially a thing called Theatre of the Oppressed. Has done it a lot here, connected to a community here up in the Eastern Highlands, and did a lot of work with them for about 5-6 years. I think he still has a deep love for this part of the world. And is about to get married, and at least for now will be living in California. So he's following in my footsteps of having like this connection with both parts of the world, and is doing it with much grace. One thing I absolutely have to mention is the role of my parents in the Jewish community in the 60s and 70s in Rhodesia. I have to tell you, every time I go to synagogue, next to that, what used to be the Harry Margolis Hall, the Ashkenazi synagogue, I always go and visit my father's plaque. There's a plaque there which has Harold Goldberg, Werner Kaim, who's the other person who helped build that synagogue. And my father was deeply involved in the Jewish community here, and I think it was central to his life. And you know, he wasn't an ultra-religious man. He couldn't read Hebrew. He could mumble when he was reading Hebrew, but he loved the Jewishness of this community here, and he loved the Jewishness of life. It was really, really important to him. And he was a leader here in the growth of the community. It was really an important part. And my mother too. My mother, in a very different way, but she too she was just there as part of the Jewish community next to my father. It was very much a part of what me and my sister and brother knew. The whole of our lives revolved around that Jewish community. And I have such recollections of Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. We filled Harry Margolis Hall. I mean, it was packed, all of us going to all those high holidays there. It's very warm and tinged with sadness now, but very warm memory of my childhood. Yeah, and my father's role in it especially. Yeah. And then another lovely warm memory was my father's visits with other members of the Jewish community to Wingate Sports Club to go and play golf every Sunday, and even during the petrol rationing, sharing the car ride, because Wingate at that stage was really far from Salisbury. In retrospect, it's now around the corner, but but you know, that long trip to Wingate they'd share because of the petrol rationing, and playing at Wingate. And that was really important to have that Jewish sports club. So Wingate Sports Club was very important. And that's where they used to go every Sunday. Okay. So my father was part of Everglow Electric for both, he started in Joburg, then he moved to Bulawayo and started the Bulawayo branch of Everglow Electric. And then the whole family moved to Salisbury, and he opened up Everglow Electric in Salisbury. So he really was responsible for all those heaters that every single Jewish family in Salisbury had in the middle of winter. And those plugs and all the electrical appliances. And my mother was this really very quiet but very talented silversmith. She made the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew letters for the synagogue in Harare, and the Kiddush cups, and beautiful stuff. She made that and got a lot of pleasure from doing her very artistic candlesticks, jewelry. Yeah, so that were my parents. Yeah. So here we are in 2026. It's a really, really small Jewish community. And there's a certain sadness I feel about that. I have a rich, really diverse community of friends here, and I love that. But I do miss that there isn't a larger, diverse Jewish community here. But that's just how life has unfolded. I see my family in the US and how they've got this large Jewish community around them, and there's a little bit of a twinge. But that's not how it's been here. It's not how it's been here. Here has been a different trajectory. We know how the Jewish history all over the world is an ups and downs life, and that's how it has been here as much as anywhere else. So, but my life is rich here. My life is filled with the angst and ups, the angst of living in a place that's very unpredictable in many ways, and also filled with the many joys of what it is to be here. And I'm really glad to have the connections with my larger Jewish family elsewhere. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to get my dates a bit mixed up. But at some point, and I think I was I must have been very young, my father decides to buy a boat, a speedboat, at Wingate Boating Club. He loved skiing. And so we'd go every single Sunday to the Wingate Boating Club, and it was a whole Jewish community there as well. And my mother would pack all these sandwiches, and off we'd go, and we'd go there for the boating. And we eventually had to sell this boat. Why? Because there was a competition with Habonim. I think that's the reason. I think there were other reasons too, but I think that was one of the reasons. And then there's also this very famous story where I must have been really young, where everyone piled into their cars to go home, and my parents forgot me. I must have been quite young, maybe, I don't know, a year, 2 years, I don't know. So one of the other families put me in the car and were hooting behind my parents, and my parents were happily waving to them, bye, bye, not realizing that I was in the car behind. And they didn't miss me at all. Somehow that's also become one of the family laws of having forgotten me but not even noticing. So that was also, I have very good memories. Oh, and the boat there was called Barbarina. So clearly I was the Lat Lamaki, and was very adored by my older brother and sister. But that was another component of Jewish life in Rhodesia. It was a good life.